Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video of the History Valley podcast. Today, we're joined by Ken Olson from Duke University. And today, we're going to be talking about the Testimonium Flavianum. Is it authentic? He says no. He published a paper on this very issue back in 2013 titled A Eusebian Reading of the Testimonium Flavianum. And I will leave a link to the article in the description below. I definitely recommend to go check it out. Okay, thank you for joining me, Ken Olson.
Glad to be here.
So I want to start us off with this question for today. What would you consider the most important of all the reasons you can think of that led you to the conclusion that the Testimonium Flavianum, contrary to the position that most scholars hold, is a complete interpolation?
I'm unfortunately going to rephrase the question that you asked a little bit. Most scholars think it's only partially interpolated.
Right.
They fully accept there are 3 parts of it. Out of 89 words in the Standard Critical Edition, they think about 30 were interpolated. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is, gosh, those sound awfully Christian to me, but the rest of it doesn't. If I take out the parts that sound much too Christian, I can believe that the rest of it doesn't sound too Christian. Okay. And they back that up with arguments that, oh, but that's Josephine language. And when I look at it, there is no basis for separating it into 2 parts on the basis of language. Both the language of the interpolated parts and the ones that people have held not to be interpolated are a good match for Eusebius of Caesarea. The decision we have to make, there are at least 2, almost everyone agrees there are at least 2 hands at work in the Antiquities of the Jews, right? So is it Josephus who wrote the rest of the Antiquities, or the vast majority of it? And then there's somebody that wrote these 30 words, and we're trying to decide, who wrote these other 60 words. That other people think, well, that could have been Josephus, the author of the Antiquities, or it could have been the author of the interpolations. And I think there's no basis for distinguishing those 60 words from the author of the interpolations. I think they're all a good match for Eusebius of Caesarea.
In your article, I remember you mentioned Agapius and Light of Scholars using his text to prove that his testimonium is more primitive than Eusebius's. Right. Therefore, it cannot go back to Eusebius, for it lacks the most obvious Christian interpolations contained in the current testimonium in our manuscripts of Eusebius's Antiquities. What are your thoughts on this?
So the problem with this argument is that Agapius does not know Greek, does not know Josephus or any other source in Greek, right? The thing is, people argue, but this looks more like what we would expect Josephus would have written. But it's not in any manuscript of the Antiquities. It's in a book called the Kitab al-Unwan by Agapius, writing, centuries and centuries later. And there's a good article by Alice Wheely, who I disagree with on other topics, from 2007, New Testament Studies. I think it's called Eusebius and the Testimonium Flavianum in Syriac and Aramaic. And she shows that what happened was Eusebius wrote, or Josephus, she thinks, wrote the Testimonium Flavianum. I disagree with her on that part. Then she thinks Eusebius wrote it in Greek, which was in his ecclesiastical history. That gets translated into Syriac. We now have, so there's a very early, around 400, translation of the ecclesiastical history into Syriac. And that gets picked up and used by various Syriac chroniclers. And then those get used by Agapius, who's writing in Arabic, but he's a bishop of the Syriac church, right? He is a Christian writing in Arabic. So the line of transmission passes only through Eusebius, right? He doesn't have independent access to Josephus. And, well, why do the Christian interpolations sound, why does it sound less Christianized? Well, Wheely does go through it and explain why Agapius or Agapius's source might have made the changes he did. Just the fact that it doesn't sound as obviously Christian doesn't mean it's not Christian.
In both here and in the article, you go through these very thorough points that the Testimonium parallels the core of Eusebius's text so much that you believe none of it could go back to the original Josephus. In light of this, What do you think of the arguments made for the authenticity of testimonium involving the James passage in Josephus, which mentions James as being the brother of Jesus called the Christ, is authentic? Because I remember just before we started this recording, you mentioned you watched the debate between James Valiant and Dr. Carrier.
Right.
I'd like to have your thoughts on that as well.
Okay, so the first thing I want to ask about that is, why do we think that the James passage presupposes an earlier passage about Jesus? Do we actually need that theory?
I'm just, what the scholars I'm familiar with say, and this is also James Valiant's belief, that is when it says who was called Christ,
right,
suggests the past tense language.
Who was called Christ? Okay. So,
or called the Christ, one or the other.
Okay, so in the second book of Josephus' Jewish War, where he's describing the governorship of Felix, he says, after this, Caesar sent Felix, the brother of Pallas, to be procurator of Galilee and Samaria and Perea, and removed Agrippa from Chalcis unto a greater kingdom. All right. The interesting thing about this passage is, well, who's Pallas?
Right.
Josephus never refers to him earlier. In the Antiquities, there are more details about Pallas, but he says this is Felix, the brother of Pallas. There is no earlier reference to Pallas. So the question is, so why is this? And why would it be in the case of Jesus, we would need an earlier reference? And let's see, Tyson and Mertz in their textbook on the historical Jesus say, well, this presupposes either that Jesus is well known, as Pallas was, in which case you wouldn't need an earlier reference, or there's an earlier reference. And I would suggest, well, maybe they're both forged, right? If Eusebius wrote the Testimonium Flavianum, as I suspect he does, and there isn't one, there are still two possibilities. Some scholars would say, well, I don't accept the Testimonium, but I do accept the James passage, and it doesn't presuppose an earlier passage. Jesus was well known at the time. But then we have to ask, is Jesus really that well known at the time? Right, so what does the passage about James say? Well, Jesus, who was called the Christ, Ananus the high priest calls together a Sanhedrin of judges with an accusation of having transgressed the law, and brings before it James, or actually the language is, he brings before it the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, a man named James. Or James with regard to his name, I think would be a literal translation of the Greek. Now, who is called Christ is going to sound funny both to Josephus' Jewish audience, who are thinking, we don't call this guy we don't call this guy Christ. Who is this Jesus called Christ? You know, right? Jews, non-Christian Jews, who are the vast majority of Jews at this time, would probably have been offended by Josephus just saying Jesus who was called Christ. They don't call him Christ. And to Romans, what would this have meant? Who was called Christ? Well, I know you've had a number of guests on your show talking about what would this have meant. So what do you think, like the Greco-Roman readers of Josephus would have understood by this term Christ?
Well, assuming that the scholars are right, that an earlier version of the text did exist, right, I guess they would have thought that, oh, Josephus is telling us that some people believe that he was the Messiah.
Okay, did Greco-Roman readers know what a Messiah was at the time? I don't think they do. Okay, for instance, Suetonius, we have 3 references that are relevant to Christ and Christianity. Okay, there's, and let me pull them up on my...
You're referring to Christus and the disturbances in Rome? Right.
So he says, he has 3, right? First, there's Claudius expelled the Christians because they were, it'd be better if I actually got the passage here in front of me. Oh, rats. Whoops, I had this. Here we go. He drove out from Rome the Jews who, stirred up by Chrestus, continually caused unrest. What does Suetonius think about Chrestus? Right, this is a very, very strange thing for him to say. And scholars have debated, is this Jesus Christ? Is this some slave with the not uncommon name of Chrestus? Right. In the case of Jesus, he just spelled it wrong and thought it was Chrestus. It could have been a slave named Chrestus. It could have been an attempt at Christ, just assuming there was a Jewish concept of Messiah. The Jews were stirred up by a messianic concept, and it wasn't an actual person. And but in any case, does it look like Suetonius actually knows what's going on there? If he thinks Jews are being stirred up by Chrestus in the reign of Claudius, well, Jesus wasn't in Rome in the reign of Claudius. It looks to me like Suetonius does not really know what this concept means. And the second passage, it's about the persecution under Nero. He says, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. But here he spells it Christians with an I. Does he even know this is related to the Chrestus in the reign of Claudius? It doesn't look like he does. Okay, he doesn't connect Chrestus with Christians. And when we get to Tacitus, right, and he says, this group called by the vulgar or the crowd, Christians, the name was actually Christus. He's correcting a common misconception. These people are called Christians, but the founder of the name was Christus. Tacitus is unusually well informed. Probably most Romans didn't know that. There's Chrestus and there's Christians. And the third passage from Suetonius, and this is from Vespasian, he says, there had spread over all the Orient an old and established belief that it was fated at that time for men coming from Judea to rule the world. The prediction, referring to the emperor of Rome, right? Suetonius thinks that this is Vespasian, who is commanding Roman armies in Judea, right? But the Jews took it to refer to themselves. The people of Judea took to themselves. Accordingly, they revolted, and after killing their governor. He doesn't use the word Messiah. He doesn't use the word Christus or Chrestus or anything. There's simply a ruler coming out of Judea. So I think for Greco-Roman readers of Josephus, they wouldn't have had any idea what this word Christ meant. All right, now Steve Mason has suggested as one possibility among others, well, maybe it was just some weird foreign name. You know, this one was Christus, this guy you've heard of called Christus. This doesn't work if you go to something like Alice Wheely's proposed reconstruction. This one was thought to be or believed to be Christus, right? This person was believed to have the name Christus. Okay, that would be a very strange reading. So, and even if we presumed the Testimonium Flavianum was authentic, it doesn't explain what the word Messiah would mean. Right? Like that readers would have been clueless about it. The only two places Josephus uses the word Christos in the sense of Messiah are the Testimonium Flavianum and the James passage from Antiquities 2200. That's it. Those are the only places he uses the word in the sense of Messiah. And I think both of those would have come out, probably came from Eusebius, who is the first outside witness we have to both of those passages. Now, Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, could expect that his readers would know what the word Christ means, that it's the Jewish Messiah. And just in case they didn't, in the ecclesiastical history, there's chapter 1 is the introduction, and then chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 are explaining what Christus is, what the concept of Messiah is. He thinks Christos is the divine logos who has contacted human beings before. He's appeared to human beings to reveal the one true God. You know, he appeared to Moses and Joshua and Abraham, and only now has he also appeared recently, right, in the time of Pilate, in order to reveal the one God, not only to the Jews, which Christus had appeared in human form before to do, right? All the Old Testament anthropomorphisms where God is said to appear in human form, Eusebius and other Christian writers understand that to refer to Christ appearing in human form. And now he's appeared to human form in the time of Pilate in order to reveal the one true God, not only to the Jews, but which had done before, but to the Greeks as well. Okay, and Greeks, the term in the Testimonium Flavianum is actually ton Hellenikon, the Greek element. He's using the word Hellenes, which would mean in Eusebius vocabulary, right, all polytheists, not just ones who are Greeks or Greek speaking. It's all polytheists, right? Jesus has revealed the one God to them. Now, Eusebius could assume his readers at the time he quotes these two passages from Josephus, which I think he has actually been at work in, right? He can assume they will know what Christos means in a way Josephus could not, right? In Josephus, it's really coming out of nowhere, which is one reason to think it's a Christian interpolation, all right? Now, one of the big arguments against it being a Christian interpolation is, well, if Eusebius were to interpolate it, why not go on and on about how, something about Jesus and how he's the incarnation of God or something? Why not do that? And I think this presupposes if he had one interpolation where he sort of did explain who Christ was, the Testimonium Flavianum, why didn't he do that second time? And I think this misses the point that all he wants to do, he's not making up the entire James passage. He just wants people to know, his Christian readers to know, the James that was put to death here is the Christian James, right? The one who is called Christ. And there's one passage in Demonstratio Evangelica 8, where he's quoting Josephus Antiquities, book 18. And he says he's quoting Josephus Antiquities, book 18. And in that case, let me get this in front of me.
Sure.
Okay. In book 8, in Eusebius Demonstratio Evangelica, book 8, chapter 2, there's a place where he claims to be quoting Josephus' 18th book of Antiquities of the Jews, which he is. But there's one interesting difference, okay? What he writes is, Josephus, himself a Hebrew, is sufficient evidence of this, giving the history of these times in the 18th book of the Archaeology of the Jews. So he's actually citing Josephus Antiquities, book 18. He says, Herod was then made king by the Romans, but did no longer appoint high priests out of the family of Asamoneus, and these were called Maccabeans, but made certain men to be so that were of no eminent families, but only of Hebrew race. Okay, the interesting thing about this is, and these were called Maccabeans, is not in Josephus. That is not in the text of Josephus that he claims to be quoting. Why has he done this? The high priests out of the family of Asamoneus, he's thinking, my readers might not know who the Hasmoneans are. So he's glossed this with, and these were called Maccabeans, just so his Christian readers will know, oh, the Maccabees from the book of the Maccabees. I know who those are. Okay, so he's altered the text of Josephus that he claims to be quoting in order to explain to his readers who these people showing up in the text are. All right, so, and I think that's what's going on in the James passage. There is no huge theological point there. He just wants to know this James who was put to death is the Christian James. All right, now, why would he do that? And I think the reason is, well, he trusts Origen. And I've watched the video of the debate between James Valiant and Richard Carey on your podcast, right? And they have this big discussion about is Origen quoting the Antiquities and perhaps over-interpreting, or is he quoting Origen? or is Origen quoting Hegesippus and misstating it as being Josephus? Now, the interesting thing is, I just did a podcast with Derek Lambert on myth vision. And when I quoted Origen, I actually quoted Hegesippus by a lapse of memory. I thought I was quoting Origen, and I actually quoted Hegesippus, which is what Carrier and I think that Origen was actually doing. He's mistakenly quoted a different source and said it was Josephus. Now, in the debate between Valiant and Carrier, Valiant felt firmly that this was not likely, that the passage was much more like what's in Antiquities than it is like what's in Hegesippus. And I think this is wrong. And in the follow-up debate, somebody pointed this out, right? That, well, there is something that comes from, that we can tell comes from Hegesippus and not from Josephus, and not from the extant text of Antiquities, not the text of the Antiquities we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the bit about James being just, right? That the Antiquities never says, the extant text of the Antiquities, the word dikaios, justice or righteous, just or righteous, does not appear at all. It doesn't show up in the text. It's not applied to anyone. Okay, but Origen says not only that that James was called the just, but that Josephus was so impressed by his justice or his righteousness, right? So that word dikaios in Hegesippus, it's there 11 times, always referring to James. 11 times we get dikaios or a cognate equivalent of dikaios applied to James. So the word doesn't show up at all in the extant text of the Antiquities. And nobody says James was just, right? That James is put to death, and then people complain about the procedural basis of the trial, right? Ananus did not have the authority to call together a Sanhedrin of judges and put people to death on capital charges, whether James or whoever. All right, but there's no hint that people thought James wasn't guilty, didn't deserve this. There's nothing in Josephus' text to suggest that. All right, so there are some other reasons that we would think that Origen is using Hegesippus, Hegesippus rather than Josephus in the Antiquities. And Valiant made a point several times that there is no causal relationship between the
death of James and the destruction of Jerusalem.
And the destruction of Jerusalem. And I'm going to dispute that, okay? All right, need to search again?
Sure. While I do that, I got a quick question. When you're talking about the follow-up debate, was that the one with Joel Pearson and James Valiant?
Yes, I could remember Pearson, but I was thinking James Pearson. That's probably not right. Yes, that's the one. Okay.
You're good.
So in Hegesippus' text, the story ends with, and shortly after, and the Greek is outhos, immediately, this is common in the Gospel of Mark, things happen immediately. And shortly after, Vespasian besieged Judea, taking them captive. And Valiant's point was, the word immediately or shortly after isn't a causal word. You say this happened, and then immediately this happened. And I think that's stretching it. Like, why else is it included why else is it the conclusion of the story if it's not a result of the action of the story? But earlier in the text, when they killed James, right, they killed James, say, oh, the just man himself, and that's James being called just. Oh, the just man himself is in error. They've just called James just. And it said, and what Hegesippus writes is, thus they fulfilled the scripture written in Isaiah, let us away with the just man because he is troublesome to us. Therefore, they shall eat the fruit of their doings. What could the fruit of their doings possibly be in this story if it's not that concluding remark, and shortly after Vespasian besieged Judea, taking them captive? There's an explicit fulfillment of prophecy here. They're saying they are going to get, God is going to punish them for this. They're going to eat the fruit of their doings, and that can only be, and shortly after Vespasian besieged Judea, taking them captive. I don't really see another way to interpret this text.
It reminds me of the Vindicta Salvatoris, avenging the Savior text written many centuries later. That says, I think it said the death of Jesus. Yeah, that's it. The death of Jesus caused the destruction of Jerusalem instead of James. And what's in Hegesippus does remind me of that text a lot.
Right. Okay. So this brings me to another point, which I discussed briefly on the Myth Vision podcast. The whole Hegesippus story, I think Origen is misreading it. All right. When he says that the destruction of the temple was due to what the Jews did to James. He's not misreading it a lot, but he's misreading it a little bit.
To a point, right.
Okay. To a point. He introduces this James, the Lord's brother, and he says, many bore the name James. This one was holy from his mother's womb. He drank no wine or other intoxicating liquor, on and on about his religious practices. Okay. He alone, I say, was wont to go into the temple, and he used to be found kneeling on his knees, begging forgiveness for the people, so that the skin of his knees became horny like that of a camel's, by reason of his constantly bending knee in adoration of God and begging forgiveness for the people. Okay, so he's called James the Just, and he's in the inner temple, and actually only the high priest, the Jewish high priest, can go in there. Like, this story is a fictional one, making James able to go into the inner sanctum of the temple of Jerusalem and beg for forgiveness of the people. Okay, that immediately after the forgiveness of the people, it says, therefore, in consequence of his preeminent justice, he was called just or righteous, dikaios, oblius, which signifies in Greek defense of the people, and justice in accordance with what the prophets declare concerning him. All right, so James is the just one, and he's the defender of the people, and he's constantly in the temple begging forgiveness for the people. What is he defending them from? He's defending them from the wrath of God. All right. So what is the story explaining? To digress a moment, James is not called the just in the New Testament. Doesn't happen. There are lots of Jameses in the New Testament. None of them are called the just. So I think this is a story that's meant to explain, if God destroyed the temple and Jerusalem because of what the Jews did to Jesus, why did he wait 40 years? Right? So we have that, like Matthew's parable of the Great Supper, which most people take to be about the destruction of Jerusalem as a punishment for the death of Jesus. This is in Matthew 22, right? Most interpreters would understand it that way, right? So if God was going to destroy Jerusalem because of what the Jews did to Jesus, why wait 40 years for them to do it? And I think this story is telling us why. James, the defender of the people, the just one, is constantly on his knees in the temple begging for forgiveness of the people. Right, in that translation, he's the rampart of the people, or he's the shield of the people. He's the only thing that's keeping God from destroying Jerusalem and the temple. The just one on his knees there to praying for forgiveness. So what happens when they kill him? Well, then God destroys the city. James was the only thing holding back God, right? And this idea of the just person, right? When God is in Genesis, when God is bargaining with Abraham, will you not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? What if there are 10 righteous men in it? What if there are 5 righteous men in it? Like, the presence of the righteous there gives protection to the whole city. And eventually you find out, well, there's only Lot, and we'll make him leave, and then God can destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so the same thing is going on in here. James is called the just one specifically because he's the thing that was keeping God from destroying Jerusalem. And once the Jews kill him, God destroys Jerusalem. Okay, back to our main topic of the James passage, and I need to look something up again here.
Sure.
I need to look up something in the ecclesiastical history. Okay, I got it. All right. So what I think happened was Eusebius is reading in Origen that there's a passage in Josephus about James.
Hmm.
All right. And in Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, Eusebius writes, of course, Josephus did not hesitate to bear witness to this also in writing using the following words. And these things happened to the Jews to avenge James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, since the Jews killed him who was most righteous. He doesn't cite that to any location in Josephus' works. Eusebius doesn't, right? I don't think he knew where it was. He's taking this from Origen, and this is not an original theory of mine. I think this is the majority opinion among scholars. This is what Henry Chadwick thinks in his translation of Origen's Contra Celsum. This is what Steve Mason thinks. This is what John Painter thinks in his book, Just James, about James, right? That Eusebius, what he's got is Origen, and he's taken what Origen says and turned it into a direct quotation, all right? And quoted it as if it came from Josephus. Now, this is extremely common among ancient authors, right? They frequently don't actually check their ultimate source. They find somebody else quoting it and they quote that. So here I think Eusebius is just quoting Origen, and he's saying this was in Josephus, but he doesn't quote it to any particular place in Josephus. But immediately following that, in Book 2 of the Ecclesiastical History, he says, the same writer also describes his, James' death in Book 20 of the Antiquities as follows. So here he's claiming to quote Book 20 of the Antiquities. He's actually going to quote it, right? He says, now Caesar, when he learned of the death of Festus, sent Albinus as governor to Judea. This is the text as we know it. And then he gets to Ananus held a session of the Council of Judges, and bringing before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, and certain others, he handed them over to be stoned. All right. This is the passage we know. This is the first person ever to quote this passage that we find in the extant text of Antiquities. Now, what has Eusebius done? Well, I think he's read in Origen that there's death of somebody named James, right? Well, he's read Origen about the death of James, you know, the brother of Jesus, and he doesn't have that in his copy of the Antiquities. So he quotes the Origen passage and he says, Josephus says that, but he doesn't cite it. And then he finds a passage about someone whose name was James, and I don't know how he would have been identified further than that in the original text. Dr. Carrier has suggested that it was James, son of Damnius, right? He could be right. I don't really know if he's right. I don't know how this James was identified in the text originally, but I think Eusebius didn't find, he's found two men named James put to death in Book 20 of the Antiquities. The other person was James, the son of Judas the Galilean,
Right.
and he was crucified. So it's not that James, but I think he's just glossed James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, because he took that language from Origen. And to justify that, I'll say, okay, one of the objections is so-called Christ isn't Christian language. And brother of Jesus isn't Christian language. And I dispute that. In fact, the so-called Christ, well, legomenus doesn't really mean so-called in the sense we might use it. It just means has the name. It's right. Josephus never uses it to put something into question, like the alleged, the way we would say it. It just means has the name. And we find this 3 times in the Gospel according to Matthew, right? Jesus, who was called Christ. It's 3 times in the Gospel of Matthew. It is Christian language. And one of the two places where Origen uses it of James is in his commentary on Matthew. And of course he quotes, you know, this Jesus, the so-called Christ, he quotes it several times because he's writing a commentary on Matthew. So the 3 times it shows up, he's aware of it. He knows that one. And the other is the brother of Jesus. People have suggested, well, he wouldn't use the brother of Jesus because Christians said the brother of the Lord or some other euphemism like that. Well, actually, if you look at 1017, just before, the the commentary on Matthew 10:17, just before he quotes the passage about James, Origen actually quotes the passage in Matthew, "Are not his brothers James and Simon and Judah," right? Matthew identifies Jesus has three brothers, and these are their names. And then Origen quotes them, or refers to them collectively as the brothers of Jesus, with that same language, brother of Jesus, with the word brother, adelphos, actually in the plural, and Jesus, Yeshua, or Yesu in the genitive. So we can parallel in Origen this language, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. We can show he uses brother of Jesus. We can show he used who was called Christ, the letter of which is taken from Matthew. So I think this language, you can make a good case, that's from Origen. And what Eusebius has done is to take the language from Origen and to gloss the passage from the antiquities with that, just because he wants his Christian writers to know, this is that James that Origen was talking about in the passage I just quoted you, which he said was from Josephus, but which wasn't. All right. Now, the whole thing doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't accept my argument that the Testimonium Flavianum was interpolated based on Eusebius. But if I'm right about that, and Christian writers are rewriting Josephus based on what Eusebius says he said in the ecclesiastical history, the case is a lot stronger for that. All right. And if I'm right at all, right, what's going on in Caesarea? Well, Eusebius is one of the few people that's in charge of a Christian scriptorium. Right? There is a Christian scriptorium in Caesarea, and in the life of Constantine, he reproduces a letter he received from Constantine asking him to produce 50 copies of the Bible. If he can really do that, that's a pretty big scriptorium in Caesarea, right? If the emperor can ask him, yeah, please send me 50 copies of the Bible, and he can produce that, right? The scriptorium of Caesarea is churning out a lot of stuff. And I think probably all of our manuscripts of Josephus were created, are descendants of manuscripts written in the scriptorium at Caesarea. And just as a backup point, we don't actually know that for sure, unless I'm right about the Testimonium Flavianum. We couldn't say that for sure, but we do know all of our manuscripts of Philo are descendants of manuscripts coming out of the scriptorium of Caesarea. That's actually known. Okay, so I think, that's a center of prediction. See, the scriptorium of Caesarea is a center of the production of Christian texts. They're producing 50 copies of the Bible. They're producing copies of Philo, who is a Hellenistic Jewish author. I think all of our manuscripts of the antiquities of the Jews are descendants of ones produced at that scriptorium in Caesarea.
So I just have one more question for you. What are your thoughts on mythicists saying, okay, so Josephus never mentioned Jesus, therefore he didn't exist? Because some of them put it that way. Do you think there was a historical Jesus, Ken Olson?
Okay, so I think there probably was a man named Jesus who was the founder, or at least the early lawgiver or standardizer of the institution that came to be called Christianity outside of Judea, right? I don't think it was actually called Christianity when it was in Judea. So yes, I think there was a person there, but I think by the time the Gospels get written down, right, in Judaism, there was a figure of sort of the word of God, or the logos, or a principal angelic mediator. And I think by the time the Gospels are written down, those two had been thoroughly confused, right? People started to think at some point, this man named Jesus was in fact the incarnation of this angelic mediator figure. All right. And I think the Gospels are almost entirely took place after this confusion began, right? That I think we know very, very little about this man named Jesus, but I think there was such a person. All right. Any other questions?
No, that pretty much covers it.
Okay.
I appreciate you for joining me. This has been a fascinating conversation. And at some point, I would like you to return when I can get some new questions prepared, because because this topic is going to be coming up a lot more often on this channel. I can tell you that right now.
I would think people would just get tired of the Testimonium and Josephus constantly.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.